Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Mariia Shynkarenko. I'm the research director of Ukrainian-European Dialogue Program. We have a very special guest with us tonight. I think many of you know, but I will still introduce our speaker today. Rory Finnin is a professor of Ukrainian studies at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Robinson College in Cambridge. He's a historian, literary scholar, public intellectual. He's most famous for his latest book, Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity, which won 8 international book awards and made great contributions in many fields. Slavic studies, European studies, nationalism studies, genocide studies. I highly recommend everyone to read it if you haven't done so yet. He also launched Cambridge Ukrainian Studies program in 2008, within which he curated and co-organized over 40 exhibitions and cultural events, and is promoting Ukrainian studies in London. And we are very appreciative of your efforts. And it is an incredible honor to have you with us tonight, and look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariia. Is it okay if I...
Of course, yes, please.
Yeah. In this wonderful library, I see that there is no ladder, and so it's kind of built for people like me. I can feel like I can grab some of these books off the shelf. Thank you so much, Mariia, for such a kind introduction. It is a real honor for me to be introduced by you. Your work is very much something I admire. I do, however, want to start with some thanks. Thanks to the Institute for Human Sciences for their support of our work, which has been consistent, profound, particularly support for scholars from Ukraine, colleagues from Ukraine. But also I think it's important, and I was inspired just earlier today by my colleague Natalia Volvach to mark something, and that is 1,000 days since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine. 1,000 days. It's difficult to digest and absorb this fact, and so for a moment I want to be explicitly present to a problem, one of many problems in our field today. And this is a problem that comes down to trying to speak when you really want to scream. I think in our fields, so often they have us dealing in theories, in concepts and abstractions, in the play of texts and ideas. And all of these things place demands on us and require us to be at something of an observational distance, at a remove from the places, the cultures, the languages that we study, from the lives of people as they're lived in real time. And with full-scale war taking place only hundreds of miles away from us, I think this kind of scholarly work can sometimes appear aloof and disconnected, even callous, even though obviously what we're trying to do is offer our own defiance to this logic of violence and ignorance. So at the start, I just want to mark something I know we all feel, and that is solidarity with the people of Ukraine as they continue to defend themselves and defend all of us here in Europe from heinous aggression from the Russian Federation. It really deserves to be said. So, as I mentioned, this library has been a venue for a number of really engaging and provocative exchanges today, and we have one more day left in a conference about Crimea, and specifically about the Crimean Tatar experience. And so my talk today is not meant by any stretch of the imagination to be a full stop. It's really just a comma, so to speak, to kind of continue our momentum. And to get started, I want to put together and put forward for you 3 propositions, 3 postulates, let's say. The first postulate is that since 2014, we here in the West, and I would say around the world, have tended to ignore, or at least downplay, the significance of Crimea as the ground zero of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Of course, the invasion operation, annexation of Crimea took place in 2014. But put bluntly, I think we've been intellectually lazy in approaching Crimea as an object of knowledge, despite its outsized and overwhelming historical and political significance. That's the first postulate. The second one, this laziness is most apparent in our lack of attention to and our lack of study of the Crimean Tatars. Crimea's Sunni Muslim indigenous people whose long-standing mainstream civil society has consistently acted and expressed solidarity with the modern Ukrainian national project and the Ukrainian state. And I think this Ukrainian-Crimean Tatar encounter, which seems to some kind of a niche area, a niche topic of discussion, I would propose to you that it should be a revelation to us in the West, because it is an unusual model of inter-ethnic fellowship and cooperation in the region of the Black Sea, with lessons for European liberalism and global Islam. And more than that, it is a case of a Sunni Muslim people seeking and helping to shape the national identity of the largest country on the continent. This is a place, as we know, Ukraine has been described, I think, very evocatively by the historian Karl Schlegel as Europe in miniature. So today, the dominant form of this national identity is civic. It's voluntarist, it's inclusive, it's based less on language, ethnicity, and more on an ethos, an anti-colonial ethos, a kind of liberation struggle whose end is democracy and the rule of law. And so this is just an illustrative snapshot from last week. This is a tweet or a post, whatever we call it these days, from the chief rabbi of Ukraine, Moshe Reuven Osman, who actually recently lost his own son to this war. His son was a defender of Ukraine. And here you see him wishing the leader of the Crimean Tatar people, Mustafa Dzhemilev, kind wishes on his 81st birthday. So what bonds these two men together, chief rabbi of Ukraine and Mustafa Dzhemilev, a legendary figure of course, Soviet history as well as Ukrainian-Crimean Tatar history, what bonds these two men together is the Ukrainian national project itself. And the filmmaker and former political prisoner, and today a defender of Ukraine, Oleg Sentsov, himself from Crimea, describes this mode of identification as being Ukrainian in spirit. And this is very much a modality of identification that a clear majority of Ukrainians embrace today. So my point is that in so often dwelling about whether or not Ukraine has had control of Crimea since 2014, we have missed the fact that thanks to the Crimean Tatars, Crimea has had some control of Ukraine itself. My third postulate: culture has been pivotal in sustaining and cultivating this relationship between the Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, and on the whole, we don't take culture seriously enough. In a great deal of academic literature before 2014, particularly in the fields of political science and international relations, this question of Ukrainian-Crimean Tatar solidarity is often just characterized as a calculus. Something that serves the political interests of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. It's even been described as a marriage of convenience. But I think in the years since 2014, years of Russian aggression that have tested Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and many still, both individually and collectively, I think it's been clear that convenience has really precious little to do with this relationship, that there is something about affect, emotion, principle that also is in the picture too. So today I would like to explore not only some of the I'd like to explore some of the cultural drivers of this critical alliance. I would venture to say that this critical alliance is something on which the future of Ukraine depends. And these cultural drivers, you see, frequently make specific and very unique singular reference to the past. And what I want to share with you are impactful works of literature, of prose, poetry, and then I'll try to end with a reference to film as well, in the Ukrainian language and Crimean Tatar language traditions that don't, as one might expect, focus on a common history of victimization at the hands of Russian and Soviet colonial oppressors. Keep in mind that both the Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars share horrific past of this oppression in the 20th century. Emblematic events include the Holodomor, the genocidal famine of 1932-33, as well as, of course, the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944, which was an event of mass death and dispossession that led tens of thousands to die. So instead of focusing on this common history of victimization, the text I want to share with you today upset fixed imperial historiographies and upset these paradigms that we're used to entirely. They nurture alternative sites of memory. They form what Hayden White, following and appropriating Michael Oakeshott, calls a practical past. Not a historical past or archival chronicle of things that have happened, but something dynamic and much more ethically formative in the present. So what does this term mean? For White, a practical past is that which informs our present with some answers to the question of what should I do? Very basic formulation. That is, a practical past offers guidance and counsel and input from a then that informs our now. So far, so good. But in White's view, the best source material for practical pasts are not found in archives. They're not found in documents that are policed by a professional circle of priests or professors. But, and by the way, White says in a very categorical way that such professors, quote, offer no lessons of interest to the present whatsoever. Rather, the most efficient source material for White for the creation of practical pasts are works of culture, are works of literature in particular. And you can see why scholars in the humanities read Hayden White very, very closely. So roughly 100 years ago, Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar thought leaders craft in earnest a practical past out of the 17th century, so out of the early modern period, when the Ukrainian Zaporozhian host, or Sich, formed a very decisive military alliance with the Crimean Tatar Khan and carved out of the space of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth a Ukrainian Cossack proto-state, the so-called hetmanate. And at this time, as the historian Oras Subtelny remarks, quote, when the Ukrainians sought to defend their political individuality, it was to the Crimean Tatars that they turned most often for support. And the seminal poet of Ukraine of the 19th century, as well as the seminal visual artist Taras Shevchenko, alludes to this relationships, and it's a little bit difficult to see in this slide right here. He does so very whimsically. So you can see in this particular sketch of 1857, Khmelnytsky pered Krymskim Khanom, how the arch perimeter of this composition joins in one very harmonious visual field, the very respectful Hetman Khmelnytsky and the very kind of comfortable Crimean Khan who's reclining over to the right. This practical past is not important necessarily because Shevchenko decided to allude to it very briefly and very obliquely here. Rather, the cultural texts that shape it, I think, demand our attention because they defy what we could call socio-cultural gravity. That is, these works of poetry and prose overcome the force, the pull of centuries of historical antagonism and stereotyping, which can still be felt today. As my Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar colleagues know, in some currents of Ukrainian cultural memory, stories of Crimean Tatars raiding Ukrainian homes in the 15th, 16th century still have lasting currency. And similarly, in some currents of Crimean Tatar cultural memory, stories of Ukrainian participating in their dispossession in the 19th and 20th century have left really lasting scars. But the works that I want to introduce to you today, or at least share with you today, only a selection, by the way, they really do work to consign these types of stories, these stereotypes, to the margins. So the question is, why are they successful, and how do they claim this mainstream? One reason is the compelling way that these texts offer opportunities for readers to find a kind of reflection of one's identity. These texts invite, very often, Ukrainian readers to see themselves in the image of Crimean Tatars and their historical experience, and also invite Crimean Tatar readers to do the same. But as we'll see, another reason relates to an implicit feature and embedded attribute that all of these texts share. Namely, they all provincialize Russia. They disrupt and unsettle Russian colonialist discourses by ignoring them. They map new itineraries of political possibility outside of the Kremlin's imperialist imaginary. And their approach, I suggest, has a lot to teach us about the project and process of decolonization, cultural decolonization. Today, this is a term that is tossed around quite a bit in academic discourses. I think these texts offer us some lessons to ponder. Now, as you might imagine, a measure of the significance of this practical past of Crimean Tatar Ukrainian solidarity is really the consistently swift and intense Soviet and Russian backlash to it. Now, an example I'd like to offer you originates in this work, Studies Krymu, or Crimean Studies, a collection of articles and resources related to Crimean Tatar culture, demography, history, that was compiled and led under the editor Ahat Angel Krymsky, the famous poet and philologist. Krymsky published prolifically on Turkic literatures, Persian literatures, but arguably his most prominent academic contribution was this volume, which is still, I would say, the most impactful work of what we call Krymsko-Tataroznavstvo, Crimean Tatar studies in the Ukrainian language. It's a really richly annotated compilation of different sources that were offered to Krymsky by Ottoman, Ukrainian, and Russian Crimean Tatar scholars as well. And one of Krymsky's Crimean Tatar collaborators was named Osman Akçokraklı. And Akçokraklı was an ethnographer, archaeologist, who contributed in this particular collection a small anthology of Crimean Tatar literature translated into Ukrainian. And he actually snuck in one of his own bits of verse into this anthology as well, to make sure he was a part of history. And Krymsky at one point also says that Akçokraklı had more to offer this volume. In fact, he had a surprise to offer, but that the surprise could not be published in 1930 because it was still working through the appropriate Soviet approvals. And the surprise was the discovery of a 17th century destan, or epic poem, by the court poet of the Khan named Jan Mohammed. Now, many of you may know this story. Many of you may have similar experiences as academics going to find materials, to talk to informants. So this will seem very similar, I think familiar to you. But Akçokraklı made his discovery with his collaborator Hüseyin Bodaninsky. So Akçokraklı is there on the left, Bodaninsky on the right. They made this discovery 5 years earlier, in 1925. The two of them were on the hunt for what are called jongleurs, which are anthologies of Crimean Tatar poetry, both folk poetry and divan poetry, from the era of the Crimean Tatar Khanate, that are often held and maintained in Crimean Tatar homes. Their expedition in 1925 had relative success, but it was really until they reached the village of Kapsihor in the Sudak region that they made this remarkable discovery. They stumbled on a handwritten manuscript of hundreds of lines, obviously in Arabic script, in something akin to what we might see as early modern Crimean Tatar vernacular. Immediately, Akçokraklı tried to purchase this manuscript. And he tried to buy it from a village elder named Haji Ali Efendi. And Haji Ali Efendi wasn't having anything. He rebuffed and refused this offer, and instead gave Akçokraklı and Bodaninsky just some time to transcribe all these hundreds of lines. So again, many of you who have worked with private family archives know how possessive those families can be. I know Professor Feliz Tutku-Aydin knows very well how this works. And so Akçokraklı and Bodaninsky got to work, and they were very amazed by what they discovered. So back to this journal issue once more in 1930. Krymski, again, has said that Atrocities has this discovery, but it can't be published. He can't contain his excitement, however, and this is what he writes. Soon this Ukrainian poem, which is so interesting for Ukrainians, will get to see the world. Now, what made the poem undoubtedly interesting, as Krymski put it, was its distinctive subject matter. And this is this area, this realm of a practical past that I want to discuss with you today. That is, it offered very abundant and colorful detail of this alliance, this connection between the Ukrainian Cossacks and the Crimean Tatar Khanate. And Krymski alludes to the fact that soon this work, indeed, that was discovered by Atrocities will see its appearance in print. And he wasn't wrong, because months later, a gloss of the poem that was discovered, as well as some passages, are published in the journal Skhidny Svit, or World of the East. And it's amazing when you look back to these journal articles, because this gloss of the poem is sandwiched between articles about class struggles of the Nogai people in the 19th century, dialects of the Greek communities in Mariupol. It just was a really eclectic and vibrant journal, and it still exists today. The World of the East, if you're a student desperate for sources, go and run to that journal. It's extremely cool. So in this article, in the World of the East, Atrocities attributes the value of Jean Mohamed's poem to the fact that it offers this really detailed glimpse of this practical past, this period of fellowship and solidarity between these groups. And he also, as my students might say, throws some shade and engages in a polemic with a Russian historian named Vasily Smirnov, whose bread and butter, it turned out, involved constantly attesting to the fact that Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars were perpetual enemies. So this is an early example of, let's say, Soviet-Russian soft power at work. But this is how Atrocities responds to Smirnov. Quote, obviously Smirnov knows nothing about Jean Mohamed's poem. So already Atrocities is sensing the kind of radioactive political content of this poem, which recalls not only this period of cooperation between Ukrainian and Crimean Tatars that is outside, indeed, the geopolitical orbit of Muscovy, but more than that, it showcases Muscovy as a subsidiary provincial peripheral power. So only a few passages of this destan are available today. And they recount the exploits of Togaybey, the Nogai commander who served the Crimean Tatar Khan Islam Girey III. And according to the highly influential Ukrainian historian Mikhail Hrushevsky, Togaybey was the genuine soul of this union between the Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. And you can see him here on the right, in amazed astonishment with Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky at the appearance of Saint Francis of Dukla, who has appeared in the heavens. According to legend, it's the appearance of this saint that frightens off the Cossacks and the Crimean Tatars from Lviv in 1648. So what makes Jean Mohamed's poem so fascinating are not battle scenes like this. There's no reference to, a saint that emerges in the heavens. But what we see are peoples very reluctant to fight in the first place. So this is a pivotal moment that precedes the clashes on the battlefield, in which Khmelnytsky's emissaries petition the Khan Islam Girey for assistance. Dediler ki ey bizim sultanımız, başvurup selam kıldı atamanımız. Batavski 80.000 asker ile kelmek için tedrik idi beze. İlimizi, kuyumuzu yıksa kırak. Cümlesini epota yıksa kırak. By the way, this use of kırak at the end of the final couplet there is called in Crimean Tatar and Turkic prosody a redif. Redif is quite literally a warrior who rides on the back of another warrior's saddle. So this redif here is actually accentuating the rhyme, which is not karek and karek. It's in fact yuksa and yaksa. So the rhyme is there, and it contributes to a kind of gallop and a drama in this particular passage. The point is here that these are the first words spoken by Ukrainians in modern Crimean Tatar literature, and they are warnings of conquest. They're warnings of invasion, as you see here. So in this epic, what you discover and what Akshokhrakle and his colleagues presented was a poem that showcases war that is not simply politics by other means. For the Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars in the poem, it's not some kind of geopolitical game. It's not about exacting tribute or enriching elites. It's rather a struggle for survival that threatens society and even culture here. Later in the Soviet period, in fact, the Crimean Tatar prose stylist, Shamil Alyadin, who is the most prominent Crimean Tatar prose stylist of the 20th century, he takes Jean Mohammed's poem as source material for a novel that he intended to finish called Togaybey. Never got to finish it. He passed away before its completion. But he features in the novel a very remarkable scene in which Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky swears an oath to Allah in the Ukrainian language and kisses the Quran 3 different times. But he takes this mood, this tone from Jean Mohammed's poem and employs it in his novel. Years after the revelation of this poem in the journal Skidny Svit, the Stalinist regime targeted Akshokhrakle. Akshokhrakle was accused of pan-Turkist chauvinism, anti-revolutionary activity, espionage. He, of course, insisted on his innocence. He called the accusations absurd. But in April 1938, he was brought together with Bodanensky and scores of Crimean Tatar members of the intelligentsia and executed. And this fate of so many Crimean Tatar members of the intelligentsia, of scholars like Akshokhrakle and Bodanensky, was, of course, something Mustafa Dzhemilev, whose image I showed you before, and we implicitly wished him a happy 81st birthday, it was something that Dzhemilev was very aware of later in the Soviet period. When he was in fact in exile in Yakutia, in Sakha, in the Soviet Far East. And at this time in the 1970s, Dzhemilev embarked on fascinating correspondence with Ukrainian Nakodumets, or dissident other thinker, Vyacheslav Chornovil. The two very often in their correspondence shared references to literature. Poems that they found spoke to an empathy from the Ukrainian side towards the Crimean Tatars, or from Dzhemilev, Crimean Tatars to Ukrainians. And here you can see Chornovil referencing a novel published in 1968 by Roman Ivanichuk called Malvi, or the mallows. This is a reference to a small white steppe flower that's common to Crimea and the Ukrainian steppe. Originally, the novel was titled The Janissaries, and it is remarkable for being an attempt to look at the history of Crimea from the Crimean Tatar language, the Crimean Tatar perspective, but in the Ukrainian language. It was published first in serialized form in the journal Vitchizna, or Fatherland, and then it was released separately as a book in a run of over 100,000 copies. So it was a very big production. It was indeed a sensation in Ukrainian literature. In fact, the politician Mikhailo Kosiv remembers it as, quote unquote, an explosion. So what made it such a sensation? Well, Ivanichuk, in his novel, gathers Crimean Tatar, Ottoman, and Ukrainian characters from this period in the 17th century, and invites the reader to visit and explore these different tangled relationships between them. And it really stood apart from other works of historical fiction at this time because it turns Khmelnytsky, who is often the focus of other writers like Pavlo Zahrabelny, it turns Khmelnytsky into a very marginal figure. He's not at the center of the novel at all. The center of the novel is in many respects Islam Girey himself. What he also does is he upsets the literary status quo by offering readers a very subtle but biting allegory about national identification in the Soviet Union. Of course, Soviet authorities were very slow to pick up on this allegory, which effectively likens the Soviet Union to a paranoid Ottoman Empire. But they caught on eventually. And so reading groups that were occasioned by this novel across Ukraine were suspended and broken up, including one that was hosted by Ihor Yukhnovsky, who was a theoretical physicist who later becomes head of the Institute of National Memory in independent Ukraine. So as a result of this crackdown, copies of the novel were taken from library shelves, pulled from bookstores, and in the pages of the periodical Pravda Ukrainy, which was the official mouthpiece of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Ivan Ichuk was severely criticized for, quote, writing a historical novel without a history, unquote. In official circles, he was spared no bitter word, as the literary critic Taras Saliha puts it. But in unofficial circles, the situation was very different. So we see something similar with the novel Sobor, or Cathedral, by Oles Honchar, in which the author's supposed sins actually make the work even more salacious and attractive. And so people are rushing to read copies of it, to transcribe various passages in their samizdat or samvedav notebooks. So at the heart of the novel is a portrayal of the Crimean Tatars in the 17th century as a very complex community whose actions defy easy categorization or caricature. In effect, Malvi clearly establishes the Crimean Tatars as the indigenous inhabitants of the Black Sea Peninsula. Indigeneity is not the term used in the novel, but it is very much a claim the novel makes, and it contradicts this emerging Soviet historiography of the era. And indeed, after Stalin's deportation in 1944, Soviet historians embarked on a campaign that presented Crimea as a gift to the Crimean Tatars. And so we see this elaboration of a trope of Crimea as a gift to the Crimean Tatars, but we also see this trope stretch its legs and encompass something more broad, and we can talk perhaps in Q&A about the significance of 1954, when it's often remembered that somehow Khrushchev offered Crimea to Soviet Ukraine as a gift, which is a very ahistorical notion. But it's around this time that you see Soviet historians making very, very specific efforts to frame Crimea as a gift to the Crimean Tatars themselves, to the indigenous people of the peninsula. And I want to just mention two Soviet Russian historians. One is Boris Grekov, who publishes an essay entitled Concerning a Few Questions on Crimean History. He does so in the pages of the newspaper Izvestia. This is perhaps one of the most salient paragons of historical revisionism you're likely to ever see. Here's an excerpt. Crimea has been the object of desire of many nations hostile to Russia for many centuries. In the pre-war period, the role of the Crimean Khanate was exaggerated, unjustifiably and completely without proof, in some historical works, in order to, let's see here, excuse me, lost my page here, in order to please Tatar bourgeois nationalists. The issue of the inclusion, Vkluchenie is the word used here, the issue of the inclusion of Crimea into the Russian Empire in 1783 was completely misinterpreted. This historically progressive event was usually portrayed as a colonial population of the Crimean Peninsula. So you can see here how this Russian historiographical critique of works like Ivanichuk's and many others beside, it comes down to this issue of possession, something that we talked about at length today in the conference. What you see Grekov doing is claiming Crimea for the Russian people. And he's very specific here. He uses the term Ruski narod, this ethnic conception of Russianness, who he claims have resided in Crimea since the early days, since antiquity. Alongside Grekov was another figure, and we can't quite call him a historian. His name was Pavel Nedinsky. He was a former censor with very little historical training. His original name is Savely Posyagin. And in 1952, Nedinsky publishes a work of popular history, originally organized and thought of as a pamphlet, and it's entitled Sketches in the History of Crimea. And this title is important because it exploited the title of another work of the 19th century by Yevgeny Markov called Sketches of Crimea. So Nedinsky's work was Sketches of the History or on the History of Crimea. Markov's work was Sketches of Crimea. And Markov's work is important because it sold very well. It was published in various editions, and it offered a full-throated condemnation of Catherine's annexation and oppression of the Crimean Tatars. So Nedinsky, like Grekov, insisted that Crimea was ancient Russian territory. Quote, Crimea should never be characterized as a colony because Crimean territory has been Russian territory since ancient times. Crimea's economic development came at the hands of the Russian people. Its towns were built by Russian workers. Its fields were tilled by a huge majority of Russian peasants and farm laborers. So you can sense rather a desperate tone here of insecurity, imperial colonial insecurity, very common in colonizer discourses. And you can also sense a defensiveness, and perhaps you also sense how the rhetoric of Vladimir Putin echoes the messages from Grekov and Nedinsky here. So this really concerted campaign on the part of Russian historians to rewrite the history of Crimea from its early days is the modeled backdrop to this novel. So when Ivanichuk is writing in 1968, he's offering very much a corrective to this scholarly work. He shows Crimean Tatars, of course, developing the economy of the peninsula, building towns, tilling fields, all the things that Nedinsky says Russians were involved in doing. And Ivanichuk makes a great point of emphasizing the innate Muslim Crimean Tatar alterity to the peninsula. This is not Russia by any stretch of the imagination, as the poet Boris Chichibabin would put it. And he consistently shows the Crimean Tatars as the autochthonous original inhabitants of the peninsula to whom Poles pay tribute, to whom Muscovite diplomats offer entreaty. So very quickly, the story in the novel is about a family led by a mother named Mariia, who's the wife of a Cossack captain whose children are abducted by Crimean Tatars and spread across the region. They pursue divergent destinies and often forget about their origins. So Maria's son Semen becomes Selim, and he enters into the service of the Crimean Tatar Khan. Her son Andriy becomes Alim and becomes a janissary in the Ottoman Empire. Her daughter Solomia becomes Malva, who eventually enters into the palace of the Khan as a 12-year-old and eventually falls in love with the Khan. Mariia, for her part, converts to Islam to survive and then spends her time trying to reunite her family in these very difficult circumstances. Ivanichuk was very clear, however. He did not conceal the fact that he intended this novel as a complex allegory for cognitive colonization, psychological colonization, and a specific kind of psychological colonization of the Ukrainian people in the Soviet period. For instance, he portrays Islam Gerey very sympathetically and showcases how Islam Gerey is rebelling against Ottoman power and effectively is showing a state that is indeed peripheral to a hegemonic force, effectively showcasing Crimea as an allegory for Soviet Ukraine itself. And by extension then, Mariia and the displaced suffering Ukrainians who are scattered all over the region are indeed reflections of the Crimean Tatars of the 20th century. So in this novel we see, on the one hand, a story of encounter, very much like Jean Mohamed's work, but you also can see here a discourse of entanglement, that these are groups that are fighting each other, yet at the same time finding fellowship in these difficult moments. And I want to finish really with a reference to a work that was not produced in the Soviet period, but rather in 2003. A striking film in the Ukrainian poetic tradition by Oles Sanin. The film is Mamay, released in 2003. It's a really provocative poetic meditation on Ukrainian identity. And it focuses not on identity as an assertion of language or confessional allegiance, but rather explores the way the steppe leaves this identity open. And Sanin spends a great deal of time weaving together, and sometimes, to be honest, it's a bit convoluted, these different Ukrainian folkloric traditions and Crimean Tatar ones, but the storyline revolves around 3 Crimean Tatars who are chasing 3 Cossack brothers who've escaped from their captivity. And one of these Cossack brothers is abandoned, mistaken for dead. The 2 other Cossack brothers grieve his loss. But the abandoned Cossack brother actually does not die. He's rescued by the sister of the 3 Crimean Tatar brothers. And as you might imagine, then falls in love. So we have, on the one hand, a story of discord between these pairs of brothers, and a story of concord or harmony between those that they've abandoned due to warfare, strife, and struggle. According to Sanin, Mamay is meant as an act of recovery of this history, this practical past of Crimean Tatar Ukrainian fellowship and solidarity. He wanted to emphasize this history of coexistence, of cooperation and union between the Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar communities. At the end of the novel, we see a child born of the union of the Cossack brother and the Crimean Tatar sister Amai. So this is a gesture to future solidarity, future union. Yet at the same time, again, very much like Ivan Lichuk's novel, we do see these brothers fighting each other. But the film offers us a great deal of dramatic irony, because effectively every action from the Crimean Tatar brothers is reflected in the actions of the Ukrainian brothers. So every time they emote, pray, chase, ride their horses, the Cossacks do the same. And so really what divides them, what causes them to struggle with each other is unclear, it's unspoken in the film. But what's left as the main message is that a future is born of this connection despite the contest, despite the warfare. So let me conclude. In the field of Slavic and East European studies, as it's traditionally called, there's been a lot of soul-searching about our intellectual biases, our various blind spots, and willful blindnesses even. It is long overdue because, of course, we have failed to understand the scope and nature of Russian aggression against Ukraine, and I would say against the European rules-based order. And this soul-searching is often connected or tethered to a term that causes some frustration these days, and the term is, of course, decolonization. And these texts remind us that in the spheres of Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar cultures, and I don't mean to be reductive or to flatten a very diverse conversation between Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian cultural actors, but we can see how Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians have been, in various ways, disarticulating Russian imperialist historiographies together over a beginning. And I think that provides a roadmap for us now. And I think we need roadmaps these days when things seem so dark. And the good news is that many of our colleagues in this very room are lighting the way on this journey with the creation of new organizations, in fact, supported by this very institution, the Institute for Human Sciences. And I'm speaking of organizations like RUTA, the Association for Central, Southeastern, and Eastern European, Baltic, Caucasus, Central Asia, and Northern Asia Studies. So this is a long name and a short name, right? And for a good reason, because it decenters our work and points us toward new horizons by reminding us of the countless understudy relationships between minority peoples and minoritized peoples, and alludes to histories, often buried histories, of interaction and solidarity, despite warfare, despite bloodshed, that I think we've neglected for far too long. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rory. It has been a really fantastic presentation, very rich. I'm really just amazed how you are able to study in 4 different languages, engage with so many diverse materials, resources. A lot of them are very rare. I think you're probably the only person who can do this job, so thank you for sharing your work with us. We have some time for the discussion, so I will start. You mentioned in the beginning that Hayden White was saying that the best source, the best material to forge this practical past is not archives, is not the historical material, but literature and film. And you showed us very convincingly how at least since the 17th century, there has been these different forms of forging this practical past, and we also see it today in our literature, in Ukrainian literature. The recent example I'm thinking of is Anastasia Levkova's book, the «За перекопом є земля». But we also see today a lot of attempts in forging this practical past also through historical archives. And a lot of Ukrainian historians are now trying to debunk Russian stereotypes, Russian mythology, and to show positive examples of cooperation between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, to kind of downplay the antagonism in the past and show more the examples of cooperation. And I'm curious to hear from you. Do you think that these two processes are mutually reinforcing, that they are helping to build this Poetics of Solidarity, what you call in your book? Or do they actually not deliberately, but somehow clash, that they somehow end up serving different goals? I would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Mariia, for the question. And I'm very aware, and this is a common experience for me, that when I'm in a room with Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, it's a bit foolish as a foreigner to sit and talk about this without engaging all of you. And we have here in this room amazing scholars of Ukraine and of Crimea in particular. And so I'm hoping that they'll chime in and contribute. But I would say, actually, first of all, Hayden White is, as I alluded to, too categorical, too extreme, let's say, in throwing history as it's traditionally understood under the bus, and instead presenting culture as the best way to instruct ourselves in various moral ways with reference to the past. So I do think in the context of theories of historiography, he's a bit black and white in this construction of a practical past, and I think he's walked back the idea in a number of different settings. But I would say that as some of the examples themselves attest, there is a great deal of intersection, interaction between the work of historians and the work of cultural figures. If it weren't for Akçokrakli looking for these jonkler, these folk anthologies, these divan anthologies, we wouldn't have found the poem by Jean Mohammed, which obviously informed certain understandings of this history in the 17th century. And were it not for that, then we wouldn't have seen Aladdin's novel, as I mentioned before, called Togaybey. So I do think that they work together. But I think one side of the equation has often been emphasized at the expense of the other. And I think in academic circles, not in popular circles, because readers, they run to Anastasia's book, or they run to see Sanin's film in some number. And obviously historians who are working in journals with archives and documents don't see hundreds and thousands of readers. But I would say in terms of our intellectual disposition towards disciplines, as I was mentioning earlier today in our conference, the humanities often gets sidelined as a productive way for us to be understanding geopolitics. That these sources also speak to the ways that people relate to each other. And at a time of total war in Europe, we need to muster all resources, all academic and intellectual resources we can. And so I'm really just trying to bring them together and explore a little bit of how they focus on this particular period. Obviously, it's a focus because there's a great deal of cooperation to focus on. So there's stories to tell about an alliance, but it's also very, very strategically helpful, because what you notice in these sources is that these writers feel liberated. They don't have to be constantly placing Moscow in this position of control. And that does open up, I think, a lot of opportunities for us to think through ways we could study the histories and the peoples, the cultures of this region of the world without constantly, putting Russian in the picture. And in fact, taking Russian out can be a very productive intellectual move, and we should be courageous enough to do it.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with that. My next question is, this practical past and solidarity that you described obviously has a long history, and it is particularly useful today when both Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians are fighting the common colonial enemy. And I'm kind of trying to think forward and dream a little bit about the deoccupation of Crimea and how helpful or how maybe not helpful, but the word escapes me. How possible maybe it would be to preserve this solidarity when both Ukrainians and Crimeans will have competing claims to the status of Crimea, to which cultural language should be prioritized, when now we are in this situation where it is inevitable for us to have this unity, and this practical past and solidarity really help to sustain this unity. But when there might be a moment in history when there will be, this. I would say, space for disagreements. How would it be? How helpful it would be to have these narratives?
I think it's incredibly important to have culture leading the way here, and I think to a degree we're caught in a trap when it comes to the idea of the deoccupation of territories now under Russian control, because we naturally think of waiting. We think of waiting for that moment of military deoccupation or political deoccupation. And what we see is a massive intellectual problem when it comes to our understanding of the war today. So if we look even from a pure military perspective, we can see that the Ukrainian armed forces have had remarkable success in Crimea. They have displaced most of the Black Sea Fleet to deep sea ports like Novorossiysk. They've destroyed something like 40 to 50% of the naval tonnage of the Black Sea Fleet. We in the West, at least in Britain, and I would say the United States, don't at all really focus on what's taken place in Crimea, because that's the occupation. That's a kind of military deoccupation when one occupier's navy leaves. And when you see military maneuvers that showcase an occupier on the defense. So right now, what we need to do, seeing these signals from the Ukrainian armed forces is to begin a kind of cultural or cognitive deoccupation. And one of those things involved, I think, studying more of the history of the region, studying the Crimean Tatar language, the Ukrainian language, trying to understand more of these interrelationships, rather than waiting for something that then we apply our knowledge and our industry to. I think we need to start right now. And culture is a tremendous instrument in this effort, because good culture, of course, showcases a multiplicity of voices. It employs techniques that bring us within a conversation rather than learning about it from the outside. And so I think those kinds of things at this moment can be really, really constructive in anticipating a potential deoccupation that would indeed be highly disruptive. We can't ignore the fact that there's been 10 years of occupation, 10 years of Russian information, a Russian information avalanche that has, in many respects, encouraged many people on the peninsula to treasure stability at the expense of what they see as chaos. So it'll be disruptive. It won't be easy. But it requires us to get ready, I think, now. And perhaps the day will never come. I think it will. I think it's almost inevitable. But I do think that culture can be extremely useful in concert with works of history and the work of historians to reach out to audiences and make us more conditioned to be open to the many different demands that a very complex, diverse population in Crimea, in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts represent.
Thank you. I guess this this phenomenon of this solidarity is possible also because both Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians have never actually colonized each other. There is no history of colonial violence, dispossession, and I mean, very far history that is it's not very easy, you know, to bring it to memory. I'm curious whether you think that such solidarity is possible between nations that have colonial relationships, or yeah.
What's fascinating, and I read about this in the book a bit, what takes place in the 1960s and 70s, particularly among Ukrainian and Nakodumsi, they didn't like the term dissidents, right? Because dissidents means that you're kind of on the outside, right? When you feel like you occupy the moral center. Everyone else is the deviant, not you. So other thinkers was often the term used in the Ukrainian case. And what you see among Ukrainian other thinkers in the Soviet period was a confrontation with guilt and complicity. The recognition that they did, in fact, participate in the dispossession of the Crimean Tatars after 1944. They did arrive on the peninsula afterwards as tens of thousands of Slavic settlers were placed in stolen Crimean Tatar homes. This is the kind of ethnic cloning that takes place after ethnic cleansing. So it's not often that you encounter various cultural figures confronting this type of history at a time when they themselves feel oppressed and alienated and marginalized. Often the focus is on one's own experience, but what you find in so many different Ukrainian dissident circles is an openness to understanding that perhaps they've been involved in injustices meted against Crimean Tatars and other minoritized groups in the 20th century, 19th century, etc. And I think that was a healthy confrontation. It's something that we need to remember today. It should not be forgotten that there is complicity among these various groups. There is contestation and struggle that we shouldn't romanticize and pave over intellectually. And these works that are engaging, that are even entertaining, you know, novels and films, bring us into a space where we can be open and to listen to stories and arguments that perhaps we might be reticent to accept in a traditional academic or intellectual atmosphere. So it's my hope that we keep working more with our cultural activists, our writers, and at the same time confront a history in the Soviet period that showed us a highly diverse community of activists who had different views about similar problems, particularly in opposition to the Kremlin.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to open floor for our audience. If you have any questions, comments, please raise your hand. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Paul.
Oh, just the microphone is coming.
I'm Polish, so obviously I dread the alliance between Togaybey and Chmielnicki. But nevertheless, in Polish historical novels, where they are presented as obviously the enemy, there is a positive fantasy of this time as a time before Catherine the Great, before like relentless centralization of the state that is associated with her. There is this idea, this fantasy of this early modern multicultural unconstrained diversity. Is that also, I just am not familiar with Ukrainian and Tatar sources. Is that the similar thing happening in those sources? This kind of idea of just diversity and time of anarchical diversity, assigned as positive thing, or what other than Russia not being in the picture, what kind of positive values and fantasies are assigned to the alliance? Yeah, that would be the question.
That's a great question, and you've just made me think that we need to bring now Polish sources into this discussion of a practical past of the 17th century, because there is indeed a lot of focus, if we think about the Romantic period in the 19th century, and if we consider works in the Polish language by Józef Bogdan Zaleski, for instance, that focus on Ukrainian events, Ukrainian tales, particularly from the Cossack era, and how much they derive entertaining content from that history. There is something fascinating about that within Polish linguistic space, because it's not as referential to Russia as some of the Ukrainian Russian language works are at the same time. So if we think about the work of Mykola Hohol, or Nikolai Gogol, initially some of his work thinks through the Cossack past without reference to the Kremlin. The first redaction of the novella Taras Bulba has very limited reference at all to Russians and Russian culture and political power. It's only the second redaction that comes out that is populated with all these references, because Gogol is reacting to some bad critical reactions to Dead Souls. And so Dead Souls is obviously a great satire of the Russian Empire. Gogol was very sensitive about critical reactions to his work. So what does he do? He amends a work he's already published about Ukrainian Cossacks of the Zaporozhian Sich fighting against Poles, and makes them into these kind of medieval knights, because he feels as though that would be a new product that he can package for the imperial reader, that features the 17th century history in a way that is highly referential to Russia. So absolutely right that in the Polish context there are moments where the 17th century is seized upon as having entertaining cultural value. And I think it's really in that context you see less of a reference than you do in the 19th century in Russian language Ukrainian culture.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Olga Wozniuk. I would like to thank you for your brilliant presentation and of course for your book. I have a question about how do you see the development of the image of Crimea in contemporary Ukrainian culture? Because according to me, after the annexation of Crimea, we have now a discovery, a moment of discovery of Crimean Tatars culture in Ukraine. How do you see the development of that image in Ukrainian culture and how it will be implemented in Ukrainian culture? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olya, for the question. It's lovely to see you. I'm encouraged by this representation of Crimean Tatar culture in contemporary Ukrainian literature. But like with many things, I feel sometimes it's almost too late. And I don't feel this way, honestly and genuinely, about this material. But I do reflect upon certain moments well before the annexation operation in 2014, when Ukrainian writers were encouraged to reflect upon Crimea and what Crimea meant to modern Ukrainian culture. There's even a moment of a literary roundtable with Serhiy Zhadan talking with a kind of Russian literary organizer named Igor Sid, who created something called the Crimean Club. And this Crimean Club had one motto, that Crimea was the center of the world, and had all these various, manifestations, readings that were really entertaining. And he was in conversation with Zhadan, and he asked Zhadan a bit about Crimea in the Ukrainian cultural imaginary. And Zhadan more or less says it doesn't have a place. And that is troubling because, of course, there were many Ukrainian cultural activists in Crimea who were vocal, who were publishing works that might have been, let's say, your traditional kind of romantic, nationally inflected verse, inspired by Taras Shevchenko and Lesya Ukrainka. However, they were publishing in Crimea. There is the periodical Krymska Svetlitsa, for instance, which was very active from the early 1990s, is an amazing resource for students if you're interested in kind of excavating this relationship. Because what you see is right from the beginning of the release of this newspaper, publications of Crimean Tatar language poetry, of discussions of very difficult historical confrontations with Soviet oppression in common with each other, recognizing the difference of experience, yet at the same time trying to find a common language with which to speak of it. That is very, very abundant in Ukrainian life in Crimea. Those Ukrainians inside the peninsula often got left out. It was like Kyiv didn't see them. And so one regrets that that connection wasn't often made prior to 2014. However, the annexation operation has, I think, opened up so many different reflections and meditations on what it means to be at home. And we see that in so much Ukrainian language literature about Crimea. There are outstanding initiatives in Ukraine like Krymsky Injir, Crimean Fig, which is an anthology project on a regular basis. Somehow our colleagues in Ukraine are able to do this annually, but they compile anthologies of Ukrainian language work about Crimea and Crimean Tatar language work about Crimea, and then translations between these two traditions. And these volumes are fascinating, and they involve some writers who are well-known, some writers and poets who are not very well known at all. And what you see is an evolving conversation taking place slowly, but it should absolutely be at the center of our attention here. Because like I said, it speaks to this remarkable interethnic fellowship that we don't often see in public discourse in Europe, or at least if we do see it, we're constantly thinking of it in terms of contestation, of struggle and division. So I think after 2014, there's been much more attention, much more kind of institutional resource devoted to making these voices speak to each other. And I think that's an amazing accomplishment, and something that in European institutions of higher education, we should absolutely study more closely.
Thank you. Yes, Anna.
Hello, my name is Olya Kornienko. I'm a fellow at IWM within the program Ukraine in Europe and Dialogue. I want to thank you for the lecture. I absolutely loved it. I'm not an expert in Crimean studies, but my question is more general. What lessons from Crimean Tatars' experience in Soviet time can be applicable in their current struggle under Russian occupation? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind comment too. I really think this is important for students and scholars of the Soviet Union in particular, that we mark just how organized and impactful the Crimean Tatar movement was, and how, were it not for the Crimean Tatar national movement, very likely what we knew as Soviet descent, particularly in the 60s and 70s, would not have looked as organized, as strategic, because Soviet dissidents constantly mimicked what Crimean Tatars did. So when Crimean Tatars began to issue these bulletins that marked arrests of their activists or published manifestos that they were sending to the Kremlin, the Soviet dissident movement did the same. And that led to things like the Chronicle of Current Events, led by Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who openly and explicitly accredited the Crimean Tatars for inspiring these hugely influential texts of samizdat culture. So essentially, we've all been learning from the Crimean Tatars for a very long time in this way. I think the lessons that I would draw in the aggregate from their experience of the 20th century is to have a cause and a purpose. And we talked a great deal about the cause of home and homeland being something that was so central to the Crimean Tatar dissident experience, that Crimea as a homeland was prayed over, sung about, and this was something that invigorated the movement and kept it going. So having a purpose and a cause. The other thing is persistence and organization. Never settling for limits, because Crimean Tatar activists, when you saw in Moscow and Petersburg, dissidents may be mobilizing hundreds of signatures, contesting the arrest of a particular activist, you would see tens of thousands of signatures in an alienated and marginalized national group, predominantly in Central Asia. So they never felt as though they were restrained in what they would do. They had a purpose. And then I raised the example of Mustafa Dzhemilev because we often think of him, he was recently on the occasion of his 80th birthday, named a hero of Ukraine, long overdue. But a really special moment in which Volodymyr Zelensky bestows this very honorific title onto him on his 80th birthday. And the one thing that you encounter when you study the case of Mustafa Dzhemilev and the many trials he undergoes is just how much he maintains a sense of humor, that his humanity is popping through with every conversation. When lawyers and judges are seeking to put him in a corner, he laughs them off. And in fact, actually gets others in the courtroom to laugh with him. He shows the absurdity of the process. And I think right now, in the midst of kind of what seems like building darkness, I think very much about his experience and the experience of the Crimean Tatars. Having a purpose, not restraining yourself, don't limit yourself in what you can do, and to stay human and to stay, when it can be possible, humorous about what's going on. It's a remarkable way of disarming the powerful, and I would say those are the key lessons, abstract in general, that I would draw for today.
Thank you. Well, we were joking today with Rory during our conference on Crimea what a luxury it is to spend a whole day talking about our research and Crimea, something that we don't do very often. And I just want to say that it has been a special luxury to hear you speak in person about your research. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, audience, for coming on Tuesday evening. Thank you
very much. Thank you, Mariia. Thank you so much. Thank you.